I wanted to start by asking you questions about getting started as a cartoonist, because I think you began as a film animator. How
I,
did you get into film animation, and how did you move from there into newspaper and magazine cartooning?
well, it all started off, I was pretty useless at school apart from artwork and maybe English. And when I was about 15, I used to go on holiday to a place called Borth in Wales. And a friend of mine and I we used to go and get into digs over there because we were both very, very attracted to a young girl called Julie. And Glyn and I would go over there every year and fight that like cat and dog over this girl. And a little bit later on I found that her brother, a stepbrother, was a cartoon film animator, and he was looking for people to train up as animators. So I applied to him, and I got a trial period. I was taken on for a trial period, and Nick became a huge milestone in my life. He was such a wonderful influence, and after a few years I was his key animator and working for him. And the thing is about animation, it was great fun because you were meeting all kinds of people. Like Kenneth Williams came to do voiceovers, and it was just terrific fun. I loved working on that way, and also seeing your work move is just it's fascinating. And the thing about animation, you're working flat out for a couple of months, and then you've got nothing to do for a month, waiting for another film to come in. And I was sending off jokes to Punch magazine and the Daily Sketch and the Daily Mirror and any other magazine that would carry jokes. Because Nick Spargo, who was my boss on the animation, was the cartoonist for the Sunday Graphic, which is now gone, and also the Empire News. And I used to sit and watch him drawing these wonderful cartoons. And I was very influenced by him. And so I used to send off to these papers, and I always expected that the week after I'd sent them in, they'd be in the paper, but of course they never were. And after about 4 years of trying, I got a cartoon accepted by a magazine called Today magazine. And they paid me £11 pounds 10 shillings, I think it was. And that was, I was earning £10 a week at the time. And I thought, this is the job for me, £11 is a whole week's wages. So I went freelance, and I started sending work off to Punch magazine and all the other magazines, like I said. And I was also doing some children's comics, which was soul-destroying, really, because somebody else did the scripts, and I used to just sit there and do the drawings. And eventually, after a long, long, long period, I got a lovely letter from Ken Mahood, who was the assistant art editor, who suggested that I tone my work down a little bit, because everything was wildly exciting and big eyes, big things, which you do in animation. And I did calm down, and I got into Punch. Punch I worked for, I started doing covers, because they'd been rejecting me for ages, and I never thought I would, but I was doing covers for them. And one day I got a phone call saying that the Daily Sketch had a cartoonist called Norman Mansbridge, and Norman had heart problems, and he was going to retire. Would I like to come on as for a trial period? And there were quite a few of us had a go at this, and for some reason they picked me. So I started off doing a very tiny little cartoon for the Daily Sketch, and gradually over the years it got bigger. And the Daily Mail took over the Daily Sketch, and I've been there ever since.
What sort of animation were you working on, and how do you think has it influenced your later work?
I tell you what, it's the best training in the world for drawing, because you're having to, 24 frames a second, you're having to draw a different drawing for every 24th of that second. And so it influenced me in that way. And I suppose we were doing cartoons for soap and for petrol and for cheese and anything for ITV at the time. And I suppose it really matured me, because I was asked when my boss's daughter was very seriously ill, and he asked me to take over the studio for about a year actually. So I was directing people like Spike Milligan. Spike Milligan would come into the sound studio, and I'd have to say, Spike, would you mind cutting it down? Would you emphasize this word? Would you do that? So really and truly, from a shy young lad, I became a little bit more of an extrovert, which helps, I think, in cartooning.
Your developed style, if I can call it that, is quite cinematic in that you fill the frame with with activity, and
Yeah,
the cartoon doesn't sit on its own in white space. Is that kind of cinematic feel, kind of high viewpoints, and does that come from your animation, or was your animation work quite different?
I think it was different, really. I think I was influenced by people like Giles, I have to admit.
Yes. So himself an animator.
Yeah, he was an animator, but he had wonderful drawings. And what I like to do now is I like to try different angles. I know I tend to do looking down, but occasionally I will be looking up, and I'll draw buildings in the background. Now, I like drawing, so I like filling it in. And you know, if my drawings are mainly about humour. They are not drawings with a tidal wave saying rising inflation written on them and all that kind of heavy stuff. I don't really do a lot of that. I'm occasionally allowed to do a very serious comment, but mainly I'm paid to try and make people laugh. Yes. So I like drawing and putting my silly characters in a decent background. And it just gives people something to look at. And also, in the background, I always hide my wife. There's always a little drawing of my wife somewhere in the background. And she might be in the curtains, she might be a puddle on the floor, but there's always this little face there. And it's really caught on with the Daily Mail readers, because they if I leave her off, they can't find her, they send in a cutting and ask me to put a circle around it. So she's a permanent fixture.
You mentioned some of the cartoonists who influenced you. Who were they in the
early days? It was Ronald Searle. I think everybody got influenced by Ronald Searle.
Yes.
So all the stuff I was sending off to Punch in the very early days were very, very influenced by Ronald Searle.
Do you mean
Searle.
in the style, or that kind
the
of whimsy?
No, the style mainly. It was that kind of wonderful broad style that he had. Terrific stuff. And later on, it was Giles, I suppose, when I got into the press thing. I hope I don't draw like Giles now, but there's a certain influence there. But it was mainly Ronald Searle, and also Bill Tidy and Punch, when I was doing Punch stuff. I loved Bill Tidy, and I loved Larry's work. They were really, really good stuff. And Bill, especially for his off-the-wall humour. I like that. And you can do jokes about desert islands, you can do jokes about this, but Bill had this wonderful round-the-corner way of looking at things, and that's what I try to do now. Try to sit down there and think up a rough, and then not be content with that. Try and take it a stage further and make it funnier, and occasionally I'll think of an idea that makes me laugh out loud when I think of it. It'll just pop into my head, and I rough that down and hope that when I take it along to see the editor, he'll get the same point of view and laugh at it at the same time.
I suppose that cartoonists, could be seen as outsiders, kind of professional outsiders in some way. But when you're working for a newspaper, you've got to be an insider, haven't you? You've got to kind of be part of the team.
I suppose so, but it takes a long time to become part of a team when you first start. I certainly didn't feel part of the team for an awful long time. I came in, I was scared to death of the then editor. I won't mention who he was, but the then editor way back in the Daily Sketch days used to terrify me, because he was so bloody rude to me all the time and treated me like I'd brought him in a dead cat rather than rough cartoon ideas. Anyway, eventually I persuaded him to let me see somebody else apart from him to choose my ideas, and I started to feel a little bit more relaxed. But I think during my whole 2 or 3 years at the Daily Sketch, I never really felt that I was important enough for them to worry. You know, I just felt always that I could have been given the elbow at any time. And then David English became my editor, and he took me on with the new tabloid Daily Mail.
So that's when the Mail absorbed the Sketch?
That's right. It took over the Daily Sketch. And he then... I'm so grateful to him, because he really, in a lot of ways, started giving me the star treatment, in that he'd publish a whole double page of my cartoons saying, "Oh, Mac's been with us a year," or there'd be this, and there were all kinds of little accolades that he put my way, which made me feel as if he quite liked my work. And then, over the years, I suppose I have become not an essential part of the paper, but certainly a part of the paper that judging by letters that I get, I get a good deal of respect, which is nice. And I do get a lot of criticism as well. A lot of people write in and say I'm rubbish, but I can ride above that now.
So when you joined the Mail, presumably Gerald Scarfe wasn't still there, but
Gerald had gone by then. It was Wally Fawkes mainly.
A few years, but he'd been there a few years before, hadn't he? Because he was presumably an example of a cartoonist who didn't fit in. I mean,
well, I don't think. I mean, Gerald
Mail.
Scarfe is a wonderful, wonderful cartoonist, a great caricaturist. But I don't think he was Daily Mail really. The Daily Mail, he was very, very heavily political, and I think that although I'm a huge admirer, I think he's best where he is now in the Times, Sunday Times. And we have an awful lot of heavy news in the paper all the time, and I think, you know, I will go in. I used to go into David English, and I go into Paul Dacre now, and I'll come in with some funnies, jokes about things that have happened, and I also put in a very, very serious one. And more often than not, he'll say, "Oh, come on, let's have a laugh," and the serious one is put to one side. But now and again, I'm allowed to do a heavy political cartoon, which I quite enjoy doing, really.
So the routine that you have for producing a newspaper cartoon starts off how? With you listening to the radio in the morning?
Oh, I listen to the radio. We get what's called a morning news schedule when I come into the office, and it's a little list, foolscap piece of paper with all the little things that the various reporters are going to be working on that day. So I have a vague idea what's going to be in the paper next day. The thing is that I like to do a cartoon about what has happened. If I was working today for tomorrow, I would be working on, I'd like to have the big story of today for tomorrow's paper, so that I know that people will have read that. Very often if I look at the schedule and there's a story just about to break and I do a cartoon about that, during the night that story will be spiked, and the only thing in the paper about it is my cartoon, and people will think, what the hell is this about? So I like to do it just a day early. And so I read the papers, I watch a little bit of television, I listen to the news, and I jot down a list of all the things that I will be thinking about. I might do 5 different subjects. There might be somebody who's run off with a dustman, or one of the political characters has done something or other. And I'll make a list of all these, and then I'll try and think of an idea on each subject, or maybe 2 ideas on one subject, and then I'll do them up in rough form, very rough form, and then I take them down to see the editor.
And what sort of time of day is it then?
This will be around about 2 o'clock.
Yeah.
And you know, if I catch him between conferences and before his lunch, I'll get an approval, and then I come back and start drawing it, and maybe I'll be finished around about 6. But one of the things I like to do with the roughs, from time to time, I'll think of one that I know will never ever be published, and that will make his hair stand on end, and I slip it into the roughs just to see his reaction. I always remember when the Queen Mum died. It was late March, and I did a rough of her jumping out of her coffin shouting "April Fool," because I think it was around about April the 1st at that time, and he looked through the roughs and go, "Yeah, that's good. Okay. What? Get out of here." But I think he enjoys that, and I enjoy doing it. And then I go off and draw it on a big piece of board, and sometimes I will get halfway through and chuck it over my shoulder in disgust, and other times the drawing comes quite quickly. But you never know.
What about other sorts of constraints on you, kind of legal constraints that the newspaper might be concerned about, or I suppose not libel, but... Well,
we are restrained in lots and lots of ways, because there's so much litigation nowadays. And I always feel it's the kiss of death if the editor says, "I like this one, but show it to the lawyer." You take it down to the lawyer. Most often they'll say, yes, that's okay, but in the old days, you knew that it would be turned out, because the old lawyers in the very early days, they were keen to keep their own jobs, and if they'd let something go through that we'd be sued over, they would get in the neck. So as soon as I showed it to the lawyer, he goes, "No, I don't think you should do that. You should do something else." But nowadays, the lawyers we've got now have been great about it. They might just say, well, maybe you could tone this bit down or tone that bit down.
You talked about, about drawing cartoons for editors who had to please the readers and please the proprietors. Who do you feel yourself drawing for? Is it for yourself? Is it for the readers?
Oh, it's always for myself, yes.
Yeah.
I've never ever drawn a cartoon that has been suggested to me.
Really?
There are lots and lots of readers telephone in or write in and say, what about this for an idea? Mainly, most often they're not very good, but occasionally you'll get somebody ring up with a very good idea. But I would hate to wake up next morning and look at my drawing and I'd know I hadn't thought up the idea. Right. So I never do that. And I really, I think the most fun part about my job is actually thinking up the ideas. And if you can come up with an idea and you compare it with everybody else's next day, and it stands up against everybody else's, or you might feel once or twice it's better. Although I wouldn't be so conceited, but occasionally you'll get a really good stack of letters from readers saying how much they'd enjoyed, or people wanting prints, and you know that one's gone down quite well.
So the paper.
So it's mainly for me.
Yes. Well, the paper doesn't suggest ideas.
No.
They don't come out.
It never happened. The only time that's ever happened is when we had the Daily Mail had got some big prize years and years and years ago. I can't remember what the heck it was about, but we were offering. It all went wrong, and hundreds and thousands of people won this prize, and we had to back out gracefully. And the editor said, "Can you do something?" So I did a joke. I think I've won this Daily Mail prize, but it's not going to change my way of life, because they never did it. I think they won about £5 bob instead of £10,000 or whatever. It was a big boo-boo by the company.
So, after many years of meeting deadlines, is the deadline a thrill? Does sweat come out on your brows?
Well,
still, or?
In the early days, I must admit, I got very, very tense about it. In the early days, I used to get in here into the office at about 7 in the morning, and I'd work through until about 3, and I'd produce so many roughs that the editor used to fall asleep when he was looking at them. There were so many of the darn things. And eventually, the hint was, just calm down a little bit, but 5 will be enough. So, as I suppose, over the years, I have calmed down a little bit, and I'm much more relaxed about it. And I think up my ideas, and I get an approval normally. Very rarely do I have them all turned down. And I know that I've got up until about 7:30, 8 o'clock at night if I really am struggling.
Yes. The
big time I panic is when they want me to do a front page cartoon for the budget day, as well as the inside cartoon. Yeah. And the Chancellor used to not sit down until about 4:30, and that really stretches your deadline a lot. And I had to think up an idea for the front page, do it in colour, as well as a cartoon for the middle. So I wouldn't get out of here until about 10 o'clock because they put the pages back. But that was a bit of a stressful time. They haven't actually asked me to do one for a good while. I think they think I might fall over with a heart attack.
You did mention about readers' letters, and I wanted to ask you about having an impact. Really the question of what impact you think a newspaper cartoon can have, what impact perhaps it should have, or how you know that a cartoon that you've done or the cartoons you do are having an impact.
Well, it's mainly through readers' letters, I suppose, and people's telephone calls. The number of people who ring in and ask for a print to be sent to them. I remember there was one that I did years and years ago, which was a serious one, and it was at the time that Bobby Sands was starving himself to death. And I had loads of priests and people going around his bed sobbing, begging him to not to starve himself to death. And I had a soldier with an arm and a leg missing, and he's saying, nobody seems to worry about the weight I've lost. And that was such a popular cartoon. Everybody was writing in for prints of that one. I even got a letter from Frederick Forsyth, the writer, saying that should be shown to every politician in Ireland, which was rather flattering. But that kind of thing, you've made an impact at that point. But as I said earlier, mine are mainly humorous cartoons, and I do get quite a lot of very, very nice, charming letters. And so I suppose there is an impact in that I've made people have the occasional chuckle.
What about politicians? Because I mean, they're part of the readership.
Yeah.
Do you
Politicians.
Do you want to have an effect on the people whose activities you're?
I don't think it will ever have an effect.
Or?
I mean, good gracious, who has an effect on a politician? They collect them. I know that Maggie Thatcher had several of mine, and quite a few of the modern day politicians have got cartoons of mine. They like collecting, especially if you're a new politician. I think they feel that they've made it if the cartoonists start using them in cartoons.
But you just see them as another part of the readership. They're not a target for you in any.
Oh yeah, I will certainly criticise politicians, but I don't think they'd take a blind bit of notice of what a cartoonist would do.
Have you had feedback from politicians? How they feel about your work, apart from asking for originals or copies?
I can't remember really having a bad letter from them or a telephone. I remember Ted Heath. When he met me, he said, "I want you to stand and have a look at me from this side." Then he turned and said, "I want you to look at that side, and look at that side, and could you draw me bloody correctly next time?" He obviously didn't like the way I drew him. I'm trying to think, but I can't think of anybody else who's been terribly critical. Well, I know that Norman Tebbit was a little bit critical. Yes, he was very fond of Nick Garland and serious cartoonists, and he thought I was too frivolous. I met him, which is a very nice man. I had a long chat with Norman Tebbit, but he did say, "Well, I'm not a great Daily Mail fan," which he wasn't. But he said, "But I think your work is very frivolous, if you don't mind me saying." And I thought, well, fair enough. It probably is.
Thank you. I wanted to ask some questions also about how you like to work and your working practices. We've touched on some of them in terms of fitting in with the production of the newspaper, but how do you like to work? What's the raw material? Do you have reference photographs that you can call up from the newspaper, or do you now use the web? How do you start?
We have a photographic library here, and they have. I'm sure if you were to ask for a photograph of the Queen's navel, they would have it somewhere. And so anytime I need references, or a panda of an elephant or a politician or somebody that I need to draw, I'll just go down to the reference library and in the old days, they used to have huge stacks of envelopes with these old photographs going back to World War I. But now it's all on computer. And so they're wonderful guys. They just turn up a photograph of whoever I want, whenever I want it. So if I'm drawing a huge big lorry, and I would really like to get it correctly, although in a cartoon form, you don't have to be too realistic. But people write in, if I draw somebody with a gun, who's somebody maybe out in Libya with a gun, or out in Iraq with a gun, and I've put the magazine on the wrong way, they'll say, "Oh, you've put that's wrong, and the handle shouldn't go this way." And I'm corrected all the time. So I now go off and get reference for it, so I know I'm drawing it properly. But what I do is I do my roughs that I told you about, the 5 roughs, and I draw on big sheets of card.
Yeah.
And I draw.
So you do this in pencil, presumably?
I draw it in pencil first, rough out the idea that the editor's approved, and then I've got a fine brush. I never use a pen. In the old days I used to use a pen, but in looking back the drawings were a bit weak and thin. I used to try and get a flexible, thin and thick nib, but now I use a brush, and you can get a nice, by pressing a little harder with the brush, you get a nice thick line, and vice versa. So I use a brush, and it's quicker, and I think you get a nice line with it as well. And then I still use a blue tone on to show where the shading goes. Now this goes back from way back since they were using zinc blocks to make cartoons, in that you'd put the tone down and that wouldn't show. It would show the printer where they had to put the little dots which make up the tone. Now a lot of cartoonists have gone into colour, but I still am a great believer that cartoons look better in black and white myself. Although wonderful artists like Peter Brooks, they're terrific, and there are a lot of people who are doing colour. Steve Bell and Nick Garland, they're all doing wonderful colour work, but I still like doing what I do in black and white. That's not laziness, because I used to do an awful lot of colour work for Punch, and occasionally I do colour work on the front page of the Daily Mail, but I just like the old-fashioned cartoon technique. Probably laziness.
And then that's sent off and scanned.
That's
for
often
the paper
it's scanned and
somewhere
it's
else,
it comes out the next day. Occasionally there'll be a big mistake in. I mean, I write my caption in pencil, and very occasionally they'll have made a completely different translation of what I've written down for the caption. And one wonderful day, I was sharing Mahood, who was the other pocket cartoonist. He's gone now. He's retired. But one day they put my caption on his cartoon and his caption on my cartoon, and nobody noticed. Nobody complained. Never got a letter. Just
On the subject of how you're working, you're talking about getting reference photographs. Have there been certain political figures that you've enjoyed drawing particularly, that you think you've captured? Are there any that you never quite managed to capture and that was frustrating for some
I
reason?
don't think I'm a natural caricaturist, but you know, when election time comes, I'll always vote for somebody with a big nose and huge ears. That makes it much easier to draw if they get in. But people like Golda Meir, who was the Israeli prime minister, she was great, great to draw. And David Cameron's good man to draw. Quite like drawing him, and also the Ed Miliband. He's wonderful to draw with those big eyes. So I like all those people. They've been really good. I mean, I really like the lot that are in at the moment. But in the past, there have been. I always had a little. Apart from the big ears, I had trouble with Tony Blair. I could never quite get his expression, and it was a bit of a struggle with Tony Blair all the time. I'm trying to think of other awkward and young people, unlined people. They're very hard to draw. You know, some people I think, God, I hope they don't become prime minister. It'd be impossible every day. So the older, the linier, the bigger noses. Now, Cameron has got this lovely kind of smooth baby complexion, with those kind of little frown, a very small mouth, and that little mop of hair, a little bit curly bit at the top, which makes him easy to draw. And so with Ed Miliband, with those big starey eyes he's got, big brown eyes. I'm glad his brother didn't get in, because he'd be more difficult. Except if you put a banana in his hand.
Thank you. The last area I wanted to ask you about was the idea of whether you feel yourself to be working in a particular cartooning tradition. I mean, whether you feel yourself to be working in a 200-year-old British tradition of cartooning. Is there something that you see extending behind you and kind of forward into the future, or do you just see yourself as...
I think if you look at British cartoonists from Gilray and Peter Cruikshank and all these other people way back, but there is a tradition of cartoons which I don't think any other country have got. American cartoons are very different to ours. French cartoons are very different. German cartoons are all very different. They seem to slot into a certain type of humour, and I certainly follow in on the footsteps of people like Giles and people like Jack in the Evening Standard, and myself. And I don't think there is anybody doing my kind of drawing at the moment. I think I'm probably last of the line. I mean, you've got wonderful cartoonists like Matt in The Telegraph, who are very simple drawings, but wonderful, funny ideas. And he is just perfect for The Telegraph on the front page. And I sometimes curse myself for picking this kind of drawing, because it takes forever to do. But I can't think of anybody that's drawing my kind of stuff anymore. Maybe when I've popped my clogs, there won't be anybody else. There'll be a totally different style of drawing.
That's another question I wanted to ask. Is where do you think that this type of cartooning, this tradition of cartooning, is going? Because if newspapers are going to change fundamentally, if they're going to go onto the web, do you see a place on the web?
Well, I think they will go onto the web.
Your cartoons are on the web?
Yeah, they are.
And is it a place that you like them to be? Do you interact with with readers there? Do they leave comments and do you read them? Or?
You're asking a chap who can barely send an email. Whether I never look at the website. I have no idea. I know it's on there because I've got a little website above my thing, but I never ever check it out. And we have solo syndications. People will get in touch with the website and ask for a print of my cartoon, which they will then send to me, and I'll sign it, and off it goes to the reader. But that's as much contact as I have with the web. I'm afraid I'm really fuddy-duddy and bit of a Luddite, really, about the new technology. But I think that eventually newspapers will fold and they'll all be on the web. And I know that this newspaper is doing very, very well and has a very, very popular website. But as far as cartooners are concerned, I just hope that all the various newspapers who are churning out newspapers, and just especially for the web in how many years' time I don't know, I hope that they'll continue to keep cartoons, because they are immensely popular. I know that, talking to my colleagues, that they are an essential part of a newspaper read. A lot of people look at the cartoon before they get down to reading the serious stuff, which is great for us. And I feel so lucky that I've come in at the very end of newspapers in the old-fashioned way of thinking about them, before the web, before the computers, before iPads, and before all that stuff. And I think I've just come in at the very end of all that era, and I've really enjoyed working for it during my period. And it's too late for me to start thinking, oh, way ahead, I must start getting my stuff onto the web. I should be off into the sunshine, sitting on a beach somewhere, I hope.